All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Ellie Hayes. I am the Executive Director for Missouri Cures Education Foundation, and we are so excited to bring you June's Lunch with a Researcher. As many of you probably know, Missouri Cures Education Foundation promotes medical research in Missouri. We bring medical research to life for everyday Missourians through our events like Wiser, Lunch with a Researcher, Brews and Breakthroughs. These forums really make the breakthroughs that we're seeing in Missouri in things like migraine research and Alzheimer's and cancer and diabetes feel personal and local because they are. By connecting researchers directly with patients and caregivers and members of our community, we hope to build trust and spark new partnerships and inspire the next generation of scientists. If you are interested in becoming a sponsor for our Lunch with the Researcher program, please reach out to me. I can be reached at ehayes@missouricures.org. Most of you received an email from me. Or if you're interested in becoming a sustaining member to support the work that Missouri Cures does, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But today, I'm very excited to introduce to you Dr. Paul Durham. He is a leading expert in the biology of pain and migraines and a distinguished professor of biology and the Provost Fellow for Research at Missouri State University. I had the honor of hearing Dr. Durham speak several years ago. I think it was 2018, maybe, at the Cox Health Research Day. And he was just a fascinating speaker. And so I'm very, very excited to have him share his research with you today. Paul, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Share the screen now. Hopefully everybody can see that. And I'm going to jump over to the lecture. Let's go to the slideshow. And we should be, is everybody good? I'm going to go ahead and hide the controls here. All right, are we thumbs up? Good to go? All right, so thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Missouri Cures, for giving me this opportunity to give you some perspective on migraine pathology and treatment and some of the more recent research that we've been working on. And so I have been studying the trigeminal system for over 30 years now. And the trigeminal nerve, as the name implies, has three branches to it. And those three branches provide sensory innervation to most of your head and face. And so if you have pain in any one of these regions in your head or face, this is going to be caused by activation of the trigeminal nerve. And so just really quickly showing my disclosures and stuff. Most of you know where Springfield, Missouri is, down here in the southwest corner, beautiful area of the state. One of the things that I want to emphasize is the idea of this comorbidity with the trigeminal system. So the trigeminal nerve basically causes a lot of human conditions that are very hard to treat. So if you have activation of the V1 branch, for example, that would be associated with migraine. If you have basically pain in the sinuses or in your nose, basically that would be the activation of the V2 branch. If you're unfortunate enough to have ever experienced trigeminal neuralgia, that oftentimes involves also the V2 branch. And then the one that I also have a lot of research funding on is actually looking at the temporomandibular joint. That's the TMJ. So if you have pain in your muscle of your mastication, for when you're chewing, or in the actual capsule, that actually is, again, something that's activated by the trigeminal nerve. So all of these different conditions involve activation of that trigeminal nerve. And then the thing that I really want to point out is having one of these conditions actually increases the risk of having another one of these orofacial pain conditions. And the topic today is going to be on migraine. And for those that suffer from it, you recognize a lot of these characteristics and stuff. So there's greater than 10% of the world's population suffers from recurrent headaches. Women are more likely to suffer from migraine. And it's estimated that up to 20% of adult women have migraine headaches at any given time. And because of the debilitating nature of migraine, it has great social and economic impact. And it's unfortunate that this quote that I have down here at the bottom was actually in the 90s when a really famous migraine researcher said that migraine is one of the most underdiagnosed and undertreated of all neurological conditions. And I think that actually maintains to today. I think we still can do a lot more work on helping to diagnose people with migraine and figuring out different ways to actually treat it. When you think about migraine as a clinician side, we think about it as basically being in 5 stages, if you want to think about it this way. The interictal stage is basically when you're between attacks. So if you get episodic migraines like one a month, this would be the time when you don't have it. The thing that we're becoming more focused on is these different stages. For the most of the time that I was in research, we kind of focus more on this stage, which is the headache phase. But there's actually a stage that kind of leads into this, and this is called the prodrome stage, and I'll come back to this in a little bit in my talk. This actually can happen a few hours to days ahead of time, and this is actually when you get increased sensitivity to light, to sound, to smells. You just become, in a word, more irritable, and your system is becoming more hyperexcitable. It's reacting to things. You're just feeling maybe even more tired and fatigued with things. This is actually, like I said, a very important part of the stages of migraine, because if you don't pay attention to this and you don't actually change your environment and help quiet down the nervous system, it can progress into that headache phase. And as most of you with migraine know, this headache phase can be very debilitating. It can lead to very severe pain that literally can bring you to your knees. It's going to give you sensitivity to light, to sound. If it's really severe, it can actually cause you to throw up, right? And then you can have nausea associated with this. Then it's really sad, but this can last up to 72 hours in some individuals. What's really, like I said, problematic is that it doesn't just go away immediately. So it basically kind of lingers, and this is the post-drome phase. And this is the part that can actually lead to you having brain fog and not feeling 100%. So think about like sometimes after you get over the flu, you never feel 100%. It takes a couple of days to get there. Well, so again, if you're having episodic migraines 1 month, you're maybe for a week not feeling well. But think about if you have more frequent migraines, like one a week, you're feeling pretty lousy all the time. And if you have chronic migraine, you are basically having this happening all the time. So you're really going to be in a pretty miserable state a lot of the time. And so one of the things that my students are always talking about is this prodrome state, because one of the things that they don't like the most is that brain fog that happens with migraine. And why is this happening? Well, the bottom line is that we live in a very busy world. And so we have this sensory overload going on. Our lights are too bright, the smells are too strong, and we have way too much noise in our environment. Right now, if you probably close your eyes and you can hear even the air moving through your ductwork, you can hear probably cars going by or whatever. There is just a lot of ambient noise always around us, and we don't even recognize it because a lot of our brain power is being focused on just filtering all this out. So what we now recognize is we have this hyperexcitable, and I like to think about it as a hypervigilant nervous system that we're experiencing because of all this sensory overload. And how do you know if you have signs of sensory overload? For me, it's usually this one. If I have irritability, if I just am less tolerant of other individuals and stuff, that usually means that I'm having sensory overload. And people that have migraine, you guys probably can have experienced some of these as well. I like thinking about like why did migraine persist in the human population? So we don't think other organisms really have migraine per se. I like thinking about this again from an evolutionary point of view, that having a hypervigilant nervous system has advantages to it. Our brains have not changed for about 200,000 years. So if you think about what our brain was experiencing 200,000 years ago, that's what we're looking at today. So what we have is the ancestral brain that basically had very little sensory stimulation compared to what we have today. In fact, when I think about this, and I've researched this, is when I think about people that have migraine, what they have is basically this increased excitability or this increased vigilance, right? So if you think about the word vigilance, you can also think about it that it's actually protective. So if you're vigilant about something, you're doing that because you're trying to protect. In some cultures, they actually talked about this as being a gift. So in different populations throughout the world, they talk about people that have migraine and this increased sensitivity as having a gift, because what allowed them to do was actually identify foods that are spoiling, for example. They could sense and avoid danger. So people with migraine a lot of times don't sleep as well. They're not going to sleep through a fire. They also have sensitivity to weather patterns and stuff. So they may know when bad weather is coming before it actually occurs. And so again, this is actually something that's very valuable when you think about it from an evolutionary point of view. These individuals that actually have migraine can help care for the children and tribe, and they actually serve this protective function. I like referring to them as sentinels. They're going to be individuals that actually can help protect, the environment or the tribe from environmental changes and such. But the price they pay for that, again, is migraine itself. And so when we think about this, I like putting it within the context of the idea that biological and social evolution are at a complete mismatch right now. So we're kind of ignoring our basic biology. So again, our brains haven't changed for 200,000 years, but our environment has changed tremendously. And the amount of social interactions and stuff that we have has changed tremendously. And this is basically taxing our system. So again, when you think about the brain, it has a certain capacity, and it's predicated on our ancestors of 200,000 years ago, not on all the things that we have coming on today. So when you think about all the stuff that's happening in today's world, that's helping to basically cause sensory overload, there's things, again, for fluorescent lights, artificial environments, all the screen time that we spend on, all those blue lights that we talk about, all the different food additives and environmental pollutants, all these things are things in our environment that actually can serve as risk factors. They can actually be something that actually makes it more likely or probable that we're going to suffer from a migraine. When you look at what are the risk factors of migraine, it's not too surprising that the one that comes to the top in almost every study is going to be stress. And we are under a lot of stress, right? In our world today, we're all under time stress. We're always driven by time and basically expectations and stuff. And then I won't even have time to get into social media and the impact of all of that. But then other things like hormones. Skipping meals is actually something that's actually a risk factor for migraineurs. You got to keep and maintain a certain level of your energy and such. Weather patterns. Some people are very much bothered by different weather patterns. Sleep is a really major one. In our research, we find that sleep disturbance is one of the major reasons why people will go into chronic migraine. The other one that I'll come back to a little bit later in my talk is neck pain and tension in the neck muscles and stuff. This is something that, again, I see that actually sensitizes that system and makes it more likely that you're going to go into a full-blown migraine attack. So we know from genetic studies that there's a genetic predisposition for people with migraine, that they have a hypervigilant nervous system. And so what that means is they're more sensitive to different environmental stimuli and such. So again, that's not a bad thing. It's just that you have to be aware that this is occurring, right? And so what we have to do is you have to be able to control your environment. And this is what we talk about epigenetic factors. So these are your lifestyle choices and your environment that can actually influence the expression of genes. And so what we always recommend with someone on the migraine spectrum is basically take an inventory of what are the things that are your triggers? What are the things that are causing you to basically have a migraine attack? I will really quickly just make the segue to someone who has is on the autism spectrum. Someone on the autism spectrum, you basically have to control their environment, to control their nervous system because it's set differently. And again, this is not a bad thing. It's not a good, it's just basically what it is. And you have to be aware of it and then work within that context. I was really fortunate to work with Roger Cady for a number of years and still continuing that relationship. And we came up with this idea of a perfect storm. And the idea is that as we go through life, right, we have increasing allostatic load. And what I mean by that is just things in our life, these risk factors that keep piling up, right? So if anybody who's ever suffered migraine probably can relate to this pretty well. Every time you start adding these on, you're lowering the activation threshold of these pain signaling neurons. So you're basically causing sensitization of the system. Think about when you sleep deprived, how more sensitive you are to light and to sound. But now put in that you skipped the meal. So now your energy, and then you have stress at work or something. And then you basically have a weather front moving through. All of these things are adding allostatic load to you. So then all of a sudden, then you have some kind of triggering thing that comes in. And oftentimes the triggers, what we find, are going to be some kind of sensory stimuli. So you're basically overrunning, basically over exerting on your brain. You're basically using too much energy to process all this information that's coming in. And your answer to this is basically a migraine attack. You're going to have enough pain and sensitivity to light and sound that you're just going to want to hide away, right? You want to actually escape it. And that's part of that whole thing of sensory overload. And then unfortunately, when these individuals have this highly sensitized system, they get into an elevator, for example, with really pungent odor, and then the floor falls out, right? So they basically then have that happen where they go into a full-blown migraine. What we do in our lab is we try to actually model what happens in migraine pathology. And the molecule that I've been studying for 30 years or better is calcitonin gene-related peptide. And the reason why this peptide is so important is because it is the one that directly correlates with the pain of migraine. So if you have elevated levels of CGRP, you actually are going to feel more pain. And so during a migraine attack, we know that there's some kind of tissue injury in the dura of the brain, and it causes this inflammatory response, which then causes activation of these peripheral nerves, the trigeminal nerve, which then leads to a pain signal going through the ganglion to the central nervous system. So this is traveling from basically the dura basically to the spinal cord, and this is what's leading to pain. And what's correlating with that is this elevated levels of CGRP. Now, there's a couple of terms on here that I have to define: peripheral sensitization and central sensitization. What these are referring to is just a lowering of the activation threshold. So when something is sensitized, basically it just takes less of a stimulus to actually cause it to be painful. So anybody who's ever had a sunburn, for example, or you just burned yourself physically, that skin is sensitized. So now if you touch something even remotely hot, you're going to feel pain from that. That's, again, so when you think about pain as being something protective. So even in a migraineur who's got, severe migraine pain. When it's infrequent, basically that's just telling you to slow down, to shut down, to change your environment so that you basically can reduce the allostatic load. Okay. So when I think about the overall balance of things, what we know with pain modulation is that there's this ascending pain pathway. So there's going to be signals coming over here from the dura of your brain, the covering of it, that basically is going to be signaling up here to the brain to basically say, this is a painful type of stimulus. But the good news is we have these other pathways that are known as descending pain signaling pathways that can actually filter this and block this. So again, think about when you're well rested, you can modulate your pain levels pretty well. You can modulate your irritability, all these type of things. But when you're sleep deprived, for example, you don't modulate that as well. And when you're sleep deprived, you get a change in the descending modulation. So putting this within the context of migraine, if you have all of these different migraine risk factors, which are increasing your allostatic load, this is going to increase ascending pain. So you're having more information coming into the central nervous system, and you're basically getting a decrease in descending pain modulation. So you're losing the filtering ability. And so you're allowing more information to come into the system. You're more hyper responsive. So that if you think about, like, again, as you start moving into that prodrome phase, you start getting more irritable. Lights, sounds, smells start bothering you more. Basically, even social interactions can start bothering you. And it's because your system is trying to adapt, and it's kind of giving you a warning that you need to basically change your environment. You need to basically try to quiet your nervous system down. Okay. So what we do in our lab is we try to model this. And one of the things that we did early on is we wanted to know if central sensitization, changes in your brain, basically that descending pain pathway, could actually cause changes out in the periphery and lead to a sensitization. And without going through too much of the details, we actually can do these really cool experiments where we can put a dye into the spinal cord, and then we can add this molecule that I'm studying, this CGRP, and then we can ask the question, does this actually cause changes over here? And the bottom line is the answer is yes. So this is kind of the data for those that are geeky and really want to do this, or more information on this, I'd be happy to share that. But the bottom line is what this allowed us to do is kind of understand what goes on in a migraine nerve. So one of the things that we know in migraine patients and stuff is that basically they have elevated levels of CGRP. CGRP, actually, the levels of this goes up when you're sleep deprived, or you have neck muscle tension or facial muscle tension, or if you're under stress. So what we're showing you is that if you have elevated, or you have sleep deprivation, these kind of things, these characteristics here, that's going to be increasing the amount of CGRP, and CGRP then can cause changes and cause a lowering of the activation threshold. So literally this is a brain problem, right? So the brain is not filtering things as well. It's allowing more information to come in. And then this is increasing basically your sensitivity by lowering the threshold to external stimuli. All right. So we have two different types of models for migraine, an episodic model, and it's, again, we use animal models to kind of mimic this so we can study drug interactions and try to identify new therapeutic modalities. The one that we actually came up with, which was, I think, pretty clever, was the idea of neck muscle inflammation. So all we have to do is just cause neck muscle inflammation, and this causes sensitization of the trigeminal nerve. And then, as I told you before, one of the major triggers for people with migraine is actually a really pungent odor. And one of the pungent odors that we use is this California bay leaf. So if anybody's been out to California, this is a bay leaf tree. There's a compound in this called umbellulone, and it activates the trigeminal system. And so we can do this in our animal models. We can just induce a little bit of neck muscle inflammation. We can come in with a pungent odor, and we get a migraine type of response in our animal models. If we want to make this a more chronic pain condition, well, all we have to do is just sleep deprive the animal after the neck muscle inflammation. So again, what we're doing in our lab is we're trying to model what we see in the clinic, right? So what are the risk factors for migraine? Neck muscle inflammation is a risk factor. Sleep deprivation is a risk factor. These two together, and for a lot of migraineurs, this is very common, that you have this ongoing neck muscle tension. You don't sleep well, you're sleep deprived, your system's more sensitized. And then you can activate the system by something like a pungent odor. Maybe it's lights, maybe it's some food that you eat, but it's going to then activate the system and cause you now to have a migraine type of episode. So we use these models again to basically try to identify molecular mechanisms. So our lab has been very fortunate in the sense that we've been able to figure out how a lot of acute migraine therapies work. So NSAIDs like ibuprofen and acetaminophen and stuff work over here to block these inflammatory molecules. Things like triptans, digipans, the other CGRP antagonists, and dihydroergotamine tend to block the release of CGRP and inflammation over here. They also tend to change things within the ganglion. This is blocking peripheral sensitization, but they also then can block the release of CGRP and other inflammatory molecules into the central nervous system. So this is basically how a lot of the anti-migraine drugs work, is by blocking the sensitization of the trigeminal nerve. So it's basically blocking the signaling pathway over here. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's just a list of these. If you look at this, there's two different major classes of anti-migraine drugs: the abortive class, which is trying to block the headache during the phase when it's actually happening. And then prophylactic is for when they're trying to reduce the frequency of them. So, if you're having multiple attacks per week, you might want to think about using a prophylactic to reduce the number and the severity of the migraine attacks. So what I want to do in the remaining time is talk to you about a few of the therapeutics that we've actually spent time on. And we've actually looked at like the triptan drugs early on in my career, and we also have published on Botox. And what I want to do is just kind of show you some of these examples of how these different therapies actually work. And I'll go through this kind of quickly, but it basically is trying to say that there are other options besides just the pharmaceuticals that you probably are aware of. There's some new ones coming, and what we'll do is we'll kind of finish up talking about these guys down here, which are we call nutraceuticals. So pretty quickly, Botox is actually being used in migraine therapy and other oral facial pain conditions. It actually inhibits muscle contraction, and it inhibits the trigeminal nerve activation. So we've published on this showing that this works. Roger Cady and I published a paper on this, and really the take-home message of this is it's inhibiting muscle contractions. So for me, when you inject in with Botox, you come up around the eyes, down through the neck and stuff, and into the trapezius. That's actually causing those muscles to relax, which is one of the major risk factors for people with migraines. So if you carry a lot of your stress in your neck, Botox might be a good option because it's going to help reduce some of the stress in there. And then what that's doing is decreasing peripheral and central sensitization. So you're quieting your nervous system down, and especially the trigeminal system. Another one that we've looked at, which was a kind of a fun study, was looking at non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation. So the vagus nerve sits right along here in your neck. It controls a lot of different functions, but this company basically came up with a device that could inhibit trigeminal activation. And it basically, what we showed in our research was that it actually worked through descending pain modulation. So remember I told you that migraine kind of can happen because of an increase in ascending pathways, this green guy right here, or a loss of function of the descending pain pathway. What's really remarkable about this is vagus nerve stimulation actually enhances the descending pain pathway. And this is the same pathway that basically morphine works through and how opiates work. So again, it's working through the same mechanism that we know that other drugs that block pain are actually functioning through. So this is really quite exciting that we actually have a non-pharmaceutical method for actually activating this system and basically helping with migraine pathology. So putting that in perspective then is what you're looking at is that the vagus nerve stimulation is basically coming into, we put it into the backdrop of all these other types of therapies. It actually is helping to block, ascending pain modulation or pain signaling and such. So again, it's helping to put a damper on all this, which is again, very different than how some of these other drugs are working. So it could be a very nice adjunctive type of therapy in addition to some of these other ones. We've actually looked at CBD, cannabis and such, and again, it's actually very potent in our system. We show that it increases these phosphatases, which are these anti-inflammatory proteins, and it actually inhibits pain signaling, which was really quite exciting. And CBD, actually, what we found is that it works in multiple sites within the trigeminal system. So it blocks inflammation out in the periphery. It also blocks peripheral sensitization within the ganglion here, and it also has central effects. So again, this is one that's very good at basically blocking ascending pain pathways and such. So what we find is that, cannabinoids, basically the ones that we were using, actually inhibit inflammation and help abort pain that's associated with migraine. So that might be an option for some people as well. And then finally, one of the therapeutics that we've actually spent time looking at is, again, just as a reminder, is the idea of blocking CGRP. And the reason why we want to block CGRP is because it is the #1 molecule that causes or is associated with pain of migraine. So it makes sense that companies would come up with a way to strategically block it. And so the way they did this is they came up with monoclonal antibody therapy. And this is what we now a new generation of drugs, basically, if you will, that we call them biologicals. So they're not pharmaceuticals, they're considered biologicals. And so they use these antibodies, which then can either recognize CGRP or the receptor, and they basically turn the system on. So if you kind of look at this review article that we have, we talk about that, migraineurs have this genetic susceptibility. They get this hypervigilance. And again, maybe this has some benefit, but in the wrong situations, if you don't control your environment, you can have this allostatic load increase. So it's just kind of a simple little meter. As that piles on, think about that perfect storm. Now all of a sudden you come in and you have some trigger coming in, like a strong odor or a noise or stress, and then basically you get this migraine attack. The way these antibodies work is they just help reset that balance. So what I think they're doing is they're modulating the system. They're helping to reduce the allostatic load, because again, that's how we basically restore homeostasis, and how we can get you out of a migraine attack is by helping you to restore basically the normalcy of the allostatic load. When I looked at life, I have spent a lot of my career looking at pharmacological agents and stuff, but I also have a plant biochemistry degree. And so for me, I look back at like plants and I think about how can we come up with strategies that don't involve just pharmaceuticals, but basically involve other means to modulate the trigeminal system. And basically for me, any compound that inhibits the sensitization of those trigeminal neurons may be useful in managing migraine pathology. And I kind of like the quote by Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, saying, "Let food be thy medicine." So again, our ancestors were able to manage these things without actually drugs. They actually incorporated things in their diet. And so really, kind of briefly, I'm going to talk to you about three different ones. Cocoa, which is, basically chocolate, and then grapeseed extract and enriched bone broth, and show you how these actually work in a similar way to activate the same pathways that anti-migraine drugs do. And so again, this is a new line of research in our lab. So as we're moving through this, what I first want to show you is about the cocoa. So this is dark chocolate. Most of you are pretty much familiar with this. One of the things that we found and published on is that cocoa is actually highly enriched in compounds that are anti-inflammatory. And not only are they anti-inflammatory, but they also block pain pathways. So we have a lot of evidence basically in cell culture and in our animal models that dark chocolate actually works this way. And then to kind of drive the point home, what we did is we did molecular studies where we actually chemical studies where we actually fractionated the cocoa, and we wanted to know what is the active ingredient, what's the one that really is the anti-inflammatory component, and we found what it is it's beta-cytosterol. So beta-cytosterol is actually it's in the steroid class. So if you think about steroid drugs are anti-inflammatory, they block pain. It's really kind of crazy though to think that this is highly enriched in dark chocolate, but it's also found in things like pumpkin seeds, wheat germ, soybeans, corn oils, rice. So other plants actually have high levels of these phytosterols, which actually can be anti-inflammatory. So they increase the expression of genes that are anti-inflammatory, like NKP1 and IL-10. And so in essence, beta-cytosterol basically has similar cellular effects as dexamethasone, as a steroid drug. So thus, adding a natural product to one's diet could have the similar health benefits as a prescription drug. One of the ones that my wife actually made fun of me when I first came home and said I was going to study this is actually enriched chicken bone broth. We all know that if we want our immune system to work better after, colds and stuff, or even after surgery, we always go to chicken bone broth. We wanted to understand how this could work. And the reason why I really like this study is that we were actually using an early life stress model of migraine. And so what we did is we basically had this model, and then what we did is we just gave the animals basically this enriched chicken bone broth for 14 days, and it actually blocked the pain of migraine. It blocked the pain signaling pathways. And so you might ask yourself, like, how is that even possible? And it's what we found is that it actually promotes basically a healthy gut. And this is something that maybe Ellie will ask me about later on. But one of the things as neuroscientists we've discovered is that basically if you want to have a healthy brain, you have to have a healthy gut, and vice versa. Think about how stress works. If you're really stressed, it really affects your gut, but it also really affects your brain. What was really remarkable with this study with the chicken bone broth is that basically it increased bacteriocetaceans. So it basically increased this commensal bacteria, and that was actually really beneficial. So what we've found is that basically taking this bone broth, you're enhancing these bacteria that actually make these short chain fatty acids and basically are protective. So these bacteria in our gut actually make anti-inflammatory molecules that go into our systemic system and basically help quiet our nervous system down and basically help prevent inflammation and such. So this again is something that we see with the chicken bone broth and also with grapeseed extract. So this brings me to my kind of final point of the nutraceuticals that we've been looking at. And this one is actually quite interesting because this is a throwaway product of the wine industry. So we throw the seeds away. This company, Healthy Origin, started actually harvesting the seeds and making a product of it. And what we found when we started studying this product is it's highly enriched in polyphenols, which are anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds. So they, importantly, what we showed is that if you feed the animals these, it actually inhibits CGRP in the spinal cord. So remember how I said if CGRP levels are elevated, it can cause sensitization of the system. It's highly associated with migraine. But if you take Healthy Origins, this grapeseed extract, we show that the CGRP levels actually go down. And as an endorsement of all this, the NIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, actually endorses this on their website as something that you should, maybe consider. How does it work? Again, it's really quite diverse. It has a high polyphenolic content with a lot of antioxidant properties. Believe it or not, it actually inhibits COX-2 activity, which is how basically acetaminophen and ibuprofen work. So it decreases prostaglandins. So it suppresses inflammation, through basically downregulation of proteins and such. And it actually even contains some beta-sitosterol. So it's, again, it kind of works like that dark chocolate does and such. And like I said, importantly, what it really does is it downregulates or inhibits the expression of CGRP. So it helps quiet the nervous system. And so this is just kind of the cartoon of that, showing that when GSC is added to the diet, basically it inhibits the pathways. It's basically helping to block ascending pain modulation. And so for me, what I like thinking about is how can you combine things? And so one of the things that I still want to do is basically combine GSC with vagus nerve stimulation. And the reason for this is because, as we were talking about, we have to decrease this allostatic load, the amount of information that's coming in. Vagus nerve stimulation works through the GABA A pathways. So this is one type of inhibitory pathway. GSC works through a different one, a different type of receptor, GABA B. But both of these are basically how the opiate drugs work and morphine works. So again, these are really potent ways to actually increase descending pain modulation and help modulate the system and help quiet it down. So I'm kind of excited about seeing if that will happen in the future. And then what I'm fortunate is I have an NIH study that's funded right now that's actually doing something quite novel. Basically, we're combining a nutraceutical, that GSC, with a pharmaceutical known as baclofen. And the idea of this is that what we have found is that GSC works through that GABA B receptor. The drug baclofen, which is used to treat different pain conditions, also works through the GABA B receptor. So the thing that we're testing, and we've got evidence to show, is that when we combine GSC, which is a nutraceutical, with that pharmaceutical baclofen, we can actually lower the amount of baclofen that's required to suppress the trigeminal nerve being activated. So it's basically anti-inflammatory, it's anti-nociceptive, or it blocks pain. And so what we're doing is by combining that nutraceutical with the pharmaceutical is we're improving the efficacy of that drug. But then the other major important thing is we're also reducing the unwanted side effects, because now we can lower the amount of baclofen that's actually needed to see the efficacy or the therapeutic benefit. So I hope that's all making sense. So the idea is by taking something that we can put into our diet as a nutraceutical, we can actually then lower the amount of a drug that's actually very effective. But what it does is it basically gets around the side effects of that drug. And so we have evidence that I look forward to publishing that study later this year. And then kind of to finish up, I always think about life just being a balance. And we talked at the beginning about like, what is the number one risk factor for migraine? It's basically stress. And that's basically comes back to our evolutionary roots of the fight and flight response. And unfortunately, we have a lot of sympathetic tone. So we basically have a lot of things that are causing the fight and flight response to be activated. Things like stress, anxiety, lack of sleep, that sensory overload that we talked about. That is all basically sympathetic system. That is all causing your system to be more hypervigilant or more hyperactive. And as you all know, when you're in that hypervigilant state, it's kind of exhausting and we just get fatigued with it, right? The thing that you have to do is kind of build into your world is basically the idea of how do you increase the parasympathetic tone? And this is done pretty naturally. So long walks, things like Tai Chi, yoga that can have deep breathing associated with them, getting out in nature has been shown to help with the parasympathetic, trying to get a better night's sleep. And then, of course, having a healthy diet all helps with that. And all of this, again, is kind of the goal to quiet the system down and restore that balance. And for me, one of my favorite quotes is, teach me the art of taking minute vacations. So these are like mini vacations throughout the day of slowing down to look at a flower, to chat with a friend, to pat a dog, to read a few lines from a good book. In other words, give yourself mental breaks, right? So we have this incredible sensory overload that's occurring because of the 21st century. We need to step back sometimes and just kind of slow the world down. This is an inukshuk. This is actually from the Inuit Indians, basically, and it means that you're on the right path. And so I kind of made my own inukshuk at one point in time when I had a long plane flight back from Barcelona. And so basically for me, it was like, again, the foundation for having a healthy system is you got to get good sleep, try to control your diet, eat the right, good foods, maybe add some of these supplements that I talked about today. Make sure you're getting regular exercise, proper breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, helping to engage the diaphragm and having that will actually help with that descending pain modulation. Think about your relationships and try to foster good relationships that are healthy for you. And then I always end it with smiling and again, just having a sense of humor about life and such. And so for me, the goal of my research is really, like most healthcare professionals, is to guide patients along a path to good health. And then in conclusion, if I can get there, oops, went past. I have been very fortunate to have incredible students here at Missouri State University. I've mentored over 110 undergraduate students and over 50 graduate students. And basically, their success has been my success. So I have to give kudos to them that they've allowed me to have so much fun doing research. With that, I'm going to stop. And I guess, Ellie, do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Now I need to get back out to Zoom to do that. Oh, I don't know what I did. Now let's see. I'll go here. There we go. And I will just, I guess. So
Just down at the bottom, stop share.
Hmm.
I think down at the bottom, there's a share link and you can stop share.
Yeah, I'm seeing the share link and it's giving me the option of just sharing. I'm not seeing the stop sharing. Do you see it?
Oh, there. I did it for you, I think.
Oh, awesome. Even better, yeah.
I gave you the boot.
Well, yeah,
good. Paul, thank you so much. I hope everyone sees why I was so inspired to bring you on and have you talk. And I know you covered a lot of information today. Before this talk, you told me that if people wanted to reach out to you, if they had further questions, that they could reach you at your email address. Do you want to give that to us one time or drop it in the chat even?
And it's in the front, it's on the first slide, but it's just Paul Durham. So PAULDURHAM. And then it's at MissouriState.edu.
Wonderful,
so
wonderful.
Paul Durham at MissouriState.edu. Yep.
Great. Well, we had some great questions in the chat, but I want to start with a couple questions that I had really quickly. So you mentioned the microbiome. So let's start there. What does the healthy gut have to do with a calmer brain?
Well, one of the things that we've come to appreciate is that, like we said, is that we don't make all the metabolites that we need, that we have these commensal bacteria that we've evolved with that live in our gut, and they make compounds that we can't make. So, for example, they can make these short chain fatty acids, and that controls inflammation within the gut, but they also go out systemically throughout the system, so they can protect your cardiovascular system from basically having, developing diseases with the cardiovascular system, but it also can do is suppress inflammation and stuff in the brain. So what we're looking at is that basically we need the gut microbiome, the bacteria in there, to make certain molecules that actually help quiet the system. One of the biggest ones they also make is GABA. And they also can make serotonin. So these are neurotransmitters that, basically affect the performance of our brain, if you will. And so when we have high levels of those, we know that the brain functions better. And again, probably the best example of this is when you're stressed, that it not only affects your brain, but it affects your digestive system, And so again, we keep coming back to the idea that if you really want to have a healthy brain, we really have to be looking more at what does a healthy diet look like? Just a real quick have you heard of the SAD diet? So it's kind of a weird thing because we always talk about the Western diet. And so one time I was talking to some of my European colleagues and we were talking about diet and the gut microbiome and stuff. And they all of a sudden started talking about this SAD diet. And I'm like, well, what are you guys talking about? I mean, is that kind of related to the Western diet? And they started laughing and I said, no, that's your own diet. SAD stands for Standard American Diet. So we're literally getting made fun of worldwide that we have such a poor diet that, and then again, that's affecting not only our gut, but also our brain. So
Well, we all should try to do a little bit better on eating those whole foods.
yeah.
I know I can improve there.
And a lot of it is like with the bacteria and stuff is what they really need is the fiber, natural fiber. So the fruits and the vegetables. So we always talk about the benefit of a Mediterranean diet. A Mediterranean diet is actually providing not only a lot of good nutrients and minerals and stuff for you and vitamins for you, but what it's also doing is that insoluble component of all those plant materials and stuff are what feed the commensal bacteria. So it's kind of weird when we think about our diet anymore. When I think about it, it's like you have to have a healthy diet means you have to be feeding your own cells, but you also have to be giving the bacteria in our gut what they need.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to ask some of the questions that have popped up in the chat really quickly. And several people have asked if this will be available. And yes, we're recording this. Everybody who's registered for the event will get a follow-up email with a link to the YouTube video once I get it all edited and uploaded. So give me a little bit of time on that, but you should have it in the next day or so. Somebody was asking about the appliance that's used for vagus nerve stimulation. Actually, we had two questions that kind of touched on that. Is that FDA approved? Is it available? Is there the name?
So GammaCore is the name of the device that we worked with. Basically, they have marketed it. It was really quite an amazing thing because, like, you know, the vagus nerve controls even the heart rate and controls so many other functions. And what they were able to do is come up with a frequency that actually could activate the vagus nerve and basically just cause this change in descending pain modulation. So it's been approved for different types of headaches and migraines. So again, it's an adjunctive therapy is how they refer to it. So most people will put it in combination with something else. But yeah, it's actually a good alternative for people that are actually building up resistance to certain drugs and such.
Wonderful. Julie asked if there's a relationship that's been discovered between autoimmune and psoriatic arthritis diseases or long COVID associated with migraine. Are you aware of that at all?
No, not as much, but I think the thing that we all talk about is any kind of major inflammatory condition is going to lower the sensitivity of the trigeminal system. It's going to make it more responsive to external stimuli. So, and especially what we focus on more is like in the head and face, right? So like if you have TMD, temporal mandibular joint disorder, have a lot of rhinosinusitis or allergies, allergic rhinitis and stuff, that's going to sensitize the system and make it more likely then that the system is going to be activated with these sensory stimuli. So we tend to think about inflammatory things as it's being systemic, and that gets back to the gut health, that when you have poor gut health, you have a lot of systemic inflammation. And those cytokines, those molecules that I talked about that sensitize the nerve cells, they're all being released. The cytokines, the prostaglandins, all those things are being released globally to go throughout the system. And all of that is just increasing the sensitivity, unfortunately.
And maybe this ties into it. Jade asked specifically about like diet triggers and if there was a correlation between BMI and migraine.
Yeah, there actually has been studies showing that higher BMI is correlated with migraine. And we think, again, part of that might just be, again, people that have, higher BMIs, especially people that have metabolic syndrome. Basically, that is going to lead to more of an inflammatory state. And so whenever you have more of an inflammatory state, that's going to lead to the sensitization. It's kind of amazing to me. I mean, even I've had several examples with older gentlemen who have really severe headaches, and they were even started developing migraine in their 50s, which is really bizarre, right? But what it was is that they had basically a back molar. So I said, well, do you have any pain in your face other than just the headaches and stuff? And they said, oh yeah, this back tooth has been giving me trouble for years. Well, the bottom line is that tooth was inflamed, right? And so it was causing sensitization of the system. And so once they went and got that tooth pulled, their headaches and their migraine went away. So it's all kind of related. So again, inflammation in one part of the body oftentimes is going to influence, structures that are more peripheral.
We talked a lot kind of about the gut biome. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about sleep. You mentioned sleep being
definitely.
A huge component. What happens in the brain during sleep that really kind of does that reset?
Yeah, so unfortunately with migraineurs, they don't necessarily go through all the same stages of sleep. So they don't have the same level of deep sleep and REM sleep. It's more intermittent oftentimes for people with migraine. So again, that's part of that hypervigilance that they won't sleep through a fire or like something happening in the village, so to speak. But normally during sleep, what should happen is when you go through all the stages is deep sleep, you actually have these neurons called on and off neurons. And so during deep sleep, I don't know if anybody's experienced this, but it's the stage when you can actually move somebody, right? So at some parts of in the sleep cycle, you actually lose sensory innervation. You're not sensory innervation, the sensation of any kind of sensory stimuli. So you basically, if someone touches you, someone does something to you, you don't feel it. So you literally have that descending pain pathway that I was talking about gets activated and you don't feel anything sensory. Okay. So that's when you're in really good sleep, right? Because during that time, if you think about this, you don't have anything coming into the brain. All that sensory stimuli is gone. And that's when your brain can kind of start cleaning house, so to speak. It can start repairing itself. The same thing is with muscle tissues and everything. So deep sleep is actually very restorative, right? So when we have good sleep, that's what it's doing, not only repairing our muscles and things, but it also works in the brain. And then they've discovered this new system called the lymphatic system, which is this fluid system of the brain that actually opens up and actually gets rid of toxins. So again, think about if you're really, using your muscles a lot, we build up lactic acid, right? And then you have to get rid of that lactic acid because it's toxic to our cells, right? The same thing happens, I think, in the brain when you overuse your brain, when you just overextend it, right? And you have all this activity going on. One of the things that we talk about is you generate a lot of reactive oxygen species, these basically toxic types of molecules, and you have to get rid of those. Otherwise, that just basically creates this inflammatory type of situation. So when you sleep, it's actually very anti-inflammatory, if that makes sense. And if you think about the power of sleep, it is the number one treatment for migraine. So anybody who gets migraines, right, they will tell you that the thing that actually relieves it the best and gets rid of all the symptoms is if they can go to sleep. And so I think from an evolutionary point of view, migraine is quite interesting, right? So you basically have this hypervigilant system. You're processing all this information. But then once you get too much information coming in, you overload the system. And then nature's way to tell you that you need to slow down is to go into a full-blown migraine. So then you get that severe headache, sensitivity to light, sound, and you don't even want to move, right? And what is that really telling you to do? Go find a dark place and sleep, right? And then that's when you can reboot. So kind of using a computer analogy there, like you're running too many programs and then basically you just need a reboot. Migraine is kind of that reboot.
Thank you. Kind of going along with that, we've had a couple questions about neurodivergency, autism, ADHD, how that goes along with migraine. Have you found that in your studies, since there is so much overlap between the heightened sensitivity to stimuli?
Well, and I think with ADHD and stuff, the anxiety is there's a huge core. So we kind of link stress and anxiety together, those two together. So most of the students that I know that have migraine are really on the spectrum. They would label themselves as type AAA personalities. They're highly controlling individuals. They're very hyper responsive to everything, hyper vigilant to everything. And again, I think what we're seeing is that correlates to having more of that hyper excitable nervous system leads you to have to control your environment. Otherwise, you will have a migraine and such. So we are actually seeing a much higher incidence of migraine in the college population. So, and it's all this sensory overload. We don't really get to step away from all the things that our ancestors didn't have to deal with, right? So if you think about it ancestrally, they didn't even really have clocks, right? They just got up when the sun came up, they went to bed. So they weren't really following these schedules. But think about how exhausting it is just to maintain a schedule. Like even right now, we have a certain time limit, right? And then we have to move on to the next thing. And so our ancestors really didn't work that way. I grew up in a rural environment where we just kind of did the chores as they came. You kind of got up and did things, but we weren't really punching a clock on everything, you know? But you think about our world today, it's really quite exhausting. And then, I won't get into social media and stuff like that, but that's part of that whole thing with relationships, right? You have to basically choose what you're watching and what you're doing in a way that's, good and healthy for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for maybe just two more questions. We are getting to the end of our talk today, but thank you for making the time. We've had a couple questions asking about the nutraceuticals that you suggested. Somebody was asking if wine or grapes would have the same effect as the grape seed extract. And somebody else was asking about the type of chocolate that you would recommend. Would it be a dark chocolate, something with low sugar? If you want to talk maybe a little bit more about those nutraceuticals.
Yeah, and the wine question is a great one because that's what led us into this. Is we knew the French paradox of anti-inflammatory and stuff like that, drinking red wines. But the thing that was interesting is we actually had a student that looked at the different parts of the grape. So resveratrol, which is the compound that you often hear associated with red wine, that's beneficial anti-inflammatory, that's actually in the skin of the grape. But then we had a student that actually took the skin, we looked at the pulp, and we looked at the seed, and we looked for biological activity. And what we found is that by far and away the most biological activity was in the grape seed. So what I would say is the grape seed is actually has a lot more biological potential, anti-inflammatory, anti-nociceptive compared to just the red wine. So red wine does have benefits with the resveratrol and stuff, but not as much as what we see with the grape seed extract.
And sometimes red wine is a trigger for people with the tannins.
Right, yes, and that's a good point too. Yeah. I mean, so far the people that we've recommended like, taking the grapeseed extract, a lot of them have seen changes in arthritic conditions. Like we had a secretary that was about ready to retire because her hands were so arthritic and stuff. She just had so much pain. She started taking the grapeseed extract and then eating dark chocolate, the cocoa, and she literally showed me pictures of her fingers and stuff, and the inflammation went down. We had somebody that was actually doing like really a lot of road work, like they were a distance runner. They were taking lots of NSAIDs and stuff to manage their pain, and instead they switched over to grapeseed extract, and they basically didn't have to take the NSAIDs anymore. So getting back to the cocoa story, the chocolate that we use is actually local here. It was from Askenosi's chocolate, and basically it was the powder. And so the higher the percent, they always talk about dark chocolate, the benefits come from 70% and above. So, and then what they talk about is like from a huge cardiovascular study, they basically showed that what fits in your palm of a hand, if you eat that like 2 to 3 times a week, it's cardiovascularly beneficial. And we've kind of seen the same thing in our animal studies. It's basically if you just consume it on a regular basis, you don't need a lot of it, but consuming it on a regular basis is basically very beneficial because it's highly anti-inflammatory. But that being said, as I pointed out, is like even like in our culture and stuff, when we were growing up rural and stuff, we would actually eat the pumpkin seeds all through the winter. So we would take the pumpkins, we'd just bake the seeds, and then we'd mix them in with nuts and stuff, and then eat them all winter long. And we didn't really at that time realize that the benefits of it. My mom knew that they were beneficial from a vitamin point of view, but we didn't realize they had all these other benefits as well.
It's incredible. So what do you wish every primary care doctor understood about the biology of migraine that's still often overlooked?
Mm, Let me think about this one. I remember you asked this before.
It was in the questions I sent you.
Yeah, honest to goodness truth with this, I've had struggled with this one, but I think it's still coming down to stress and the stress being manifested in neck muscle tension. One of the things I learned from my PT friends is that the physical therapy groups is that women tend to carry stress more in their shoulders and neck muscles. And so I think there's been an underappreciation of how much of a role that plays in the sensitization of the system. And that's because in our research, what we've shown is that the muscles here actually project into the same place that the trigeminal nerves do. So like in the spinal cord here, the ones that are sensing all the tension here are going into the same spot where the trigeminal nerves are coming in. And what that does is it's lowering the sensitization. So remember, like in that one slide, I had neck muscle tension and elevated CGRP levels. That is actually causing the whole system, the trigeminal system, become more sensitized. So I think one of the things that we have to address is how do you relax this? How do you do this? And it's crazy because think about how often you go home at night, probably, and people that are online right now thinking about this. We spend so much time looking at computer screens, right? And then all of a sudden you get in your car and you go to turn your head to look at something and you can't turn your head because you've actually stayed in the same position too long. So it's not just stress that's doing it, it's part of our work ethic, right? We just tend to hunker down, look at a screen for so long, and that you're engaging those muscles, and then they get really tight. So one of the things I would love to see is like, more emphasis on, like in our oral facial pain community, for example, we've actually invited physical therapists to come to our meetings. And we're trying to educate, we're trying to approach it in a more holistic approach of saying that what we really need to do is get some of that allostatic load down. So I think about all this neck muscle tension and stuff as being one of the allostatic loads or risk factors. And so if we can get that reduced, that would be really beneficial. And then I think a lot of it is one of my last slides is just showing how do you activate the parasympathetic system. I think teaching it's kind of lost, right? Of just how fundamentally important it is from a biological point of view to deep breathe. You're a singer, so you probably diaphragmatically breathe. You know what I mean when I say that. When I teach Tai Chi, this class in Tai Chi, one of the first things that I start with is teaching them how to breathe. And one of the ways that you can teach yourself how to rebreathe and not be a chest breather, but be a diaphragmatic breather is just lay down on the floor and then put a little book down by your belly button and then see if you can raise the book. Have you ever done that?
Mhm.
See that is, so what I do is I have people, when I teach Tai Chi, I have them do it first on the floor, then I have them sitting doing it, and then I have them standing doing it. And then once they can engage that all in those three steps, then they can actually then start Tai Chi, right? But it's still coming back to that basic principle that deep breathing activates that descending pain pathway. So think about if you actually get an injury, what is one of the first things we say when someone's really in a lot of pain?
Breathe.
Breathe, just breathe. Take deep breaths. I mean, Lamaze, right? The whole thing with birthing and stuff that we say is take deep breaths. And that's engaging that descending pain pathway. And so I think again, if we could educate people of how powerful that really is, and just not that would be one of the things I think that's underappreciated is just kind of following our own biology, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Durham, for this incredible talk. We are so grateful for your expertise and for the very interesting ways that you present the information that's easy to follow along. I'm so grateful for you. I wanted to let everybody who's here know that we do our lunch with a researcher the first Thursday of every month, except July because it's conflicting with the 4th of July. So we'll do it the second Thursday that month. So stay tuned. We will keep you up to date about our upcoming programming. We also are relaunching our Wiser program coming back on November 6th. I'm very excited about that. That's our Women in Science, Entrepreneurship, and Research event. And I will be sending a follow-up email with the video of this presentation. And I also think when you log off today, you should get a survey. And I would be grateful if you would take a few minutes. It's very short. Just fill that out. Let us know what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. And I told Dr. Durham I would share it with him. So if you have any great things you want to let him know, please be sure to add it. And with that, I just want to be really respectful of everyone's time. Thank you again, Dr. Durham. I'm so grateful.
Oh, thank you.
Today.
I appreciate it. Yes.
Yeah, and thanks for everybody for joining us today. It was great to spend the lunch hour with you.
Yeah,
Take care.
thank you. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.